and welcome to the next edition of Reclaiming My Mind. I'm your host, Jessica Vaughn, and today we are honored to have a very special guest, Mr. Jeff Weaver, who is Bernie Sanders' former campaign manager and longtime associate, and we'll get more into that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Weaver. Would you want me to call you Jeff?
Me Jeff? Please do not call me Mr.
I should have realized that from other interviews to call you Jeff.
Please, yeah.
So
absolutely happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. Now, I want to talk about why we're interviewing you. So you've come out with a new book, How Bernie Won. And congratulations. From the reviews that I've read, it's overwhelmingly popular. It's gotten a lot of great reviews. So congratulations on that. But tell me a little bit. You're welcome. Tell me a little bit about what prompted you to write this book and what you were hoping to kind of convey to the readers.
Yeah, so it became clear to me after the primary process that somebody had to tell the inside story of the campaign and put the campaign in the context of the history of the modern Democratic Party and to talk a little bit about where we need to go from here, because it's obviously an issue I think that's on many progressive-minded people's minds. And it seemed to me that if it was going to get done, that I was going to be the one to do it. You know, given my role in the campaign, it actually takes a lot of time to write a book, and I had an opportunity to have that kind of time. And so I wanted to do that. And I also wanted to, in the course of a presidential campaign, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of false narratives that are spread around about campaigns that are, spread to satisfy the electoral goals of the opposing campaign. And I wanted to sort of talk about all of that as well. There's a lot of issues in the book that talk about some of the myths that were perpetuated during the campaign that have been debunked since through research and other reporting. And so I wanted to talk about those as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So for the book, for me, the way that I would describe it is it starts off with the background of Bernie, which was really enlightening for me because even though I followed him closely, there were so many things about his career I didn't realize. And a few of the things that I wanted to kind of point out that I thought were really interesting was how even from the beginning, he was a leader in the anti-assault rifle movement, and how actually that had been a detriment to him early on because Vermont, was very pro guns, as are a lot of state, it sounded like, and how integral that was into getting him elected, and how I believe his opponent had about-faced on his stance on guns, and that really helped push Bernie over the edge, because I feel like one of the myths that I was even prey to during the campaign was the fact that, he was more pro-gun and wasn't really, on the forefront of gun reform. So that was enlightening to me. Is there anything you want to...
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, back in 1988, when Bernie was running for Congress, the first time I worked for him when he was running for Congress in 88, I remember the questionnaire was from the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen, and it asked whether or not you support a ban on assault weapons. Mm-hmm. And Bernie wrote yes, and the Democratic candidate, it was a three-way race at that point. The Democratic candidate wrote no, the Republican candidate wrote no, and Bernie lost that race by just a couple of percentage points.
I think you said 3.
Yes, and that certainly played a role in his loss. The Republican won that race. The Democrat came in third. And the Republican went to Congress and then fairly soon afterwards flipped his position to being against a ban to being for a ban. And there were a lot of rural people in Vermont who were very upset because they felt like he had not been honest with them, right? And, some of those rural folks abandoned that Republican in that race. And there's some contemporary documents about folks saying, well, we'll get Bernie in there and we'll get rid of him 2 years later. And that obviously didn't happen. They didn't get rid of him 2 years later, for sure. But he has been, since 88, a consistent supporter of the assault weapons ban. He has voted for it at every opportunity in the Congress.
So that was really enlightening because that's an issue dear to my heart that, there were a few that I felt a little unsure about, even though I was a full Bernie supporter. So I was glad I got some information about that. Also, what I thought was interesting, especially living here in Florida, was his support of the Immokalee workers and how much he had pushed for their rights, and really the heartening story of bringing them to testify before Congress when you said there are usually so many lobbyists testifying in those events. So tell me a little bit more about that, because I think the people in Florida, especially a lot of my activist friends, are connected to that community.
Yeah, so it was actually one of the first things that he did after becoming a senator. He was elected in 2006, so became a senator in the January of 2007. And he became aware of the conditions in Immokalee and wanted to go there. Mm-hmm. And, needless to say, It's a place that's far from Vermont in many, many ways. And the day he arrived in Immokalee, Florida, there were arrests that were done on charges of human slavery in Immokalee. So the situation there was very dire. The treatment of people working in the tomato fields of Florida were incredibly tragic. And, Bernie went to the 6 a.m., 5:30 a.m. Place where all the workers come to be picked by the bosses to work in the fields. And obviously workers who were, agitating for a better life for workers were often not picked. And so they had there was a great economic price to be paid for standing up for your fellow workers. And Bernie told the Immokalee workers at an event that night that he would not forget them and that he would bring it to Washington. And he came back to Washington, and Ted Kennedy and Dick Durbin and others were very interested in this issue. And Bernie arranged for this hearing to be held. Ted Kennedy was the chair, but he let Bernie chair the actual meeting. And it was really a very unusual meeting because, as you mentioned, as I mentioned in the book, these meetings are typically dominated by either lobbyists or administration representatives at these hearings. And this was the first hearing I could really remember where it was really dominated by people from a marginalized community. Some of who had a lot of concerns about walking into a federal building, who may have had undocumented status, who didn't have a great command of English language. Bernie assured everybody and got assurances from leadership in the Congress that if folks came there, everything would be fine. It's very rare you hear testimony about the real life experience of people who are struggling at the lowest level of the economic ladder.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like lending their voices had a huge impact in, promoting rights, getting that passed and promoting rights. What exactly was passed because of that?
So they had organized a campaign, it was an organic grassroots campaign to get the people who were buying the tomatoes on the wholesale market, and I don't get too deep into the tomato market, but tomatoes grown in Florida are typically sold as fresh tomato products and used in fast food. Tomatoes in California are more often used in processed foods, right? Like spaghetti sauce or what have you. So a lot of fast food restaurants were buying the tomatoes that were grown in Florida. And the idea was that if these companies would pay 1 penny a pound, just a penny a pound over the market price, put that into a fund that would then be paid out to workers based on how much they had contributed in terms of their work, that it would have a substantial impact on their lives. And the owners of the tomato fields were very resistant to this, primarily because they didn't want the government interfering in the quote-unquote marketplace and what have you.
Sure, of course.
Some of the food companies were helpful. Yum Brands, which is Taco Bell and KFC and Pizza Hut were sort of supportive. The big campaign at that time was against Burger King. McDonald's was sort of trying to keep its head down. Anyway, all the players that everybody knows. But the publicity that was brought to this issue, by the congressional hearings and by the work of people themselves on the ground, look, this always is a combination of grassroots and then, help from above and people working from below. And so this penny a pound program was adopted, and it has resulted in tens of millions of dollars of additional money for the folks in that community. So tremendous, victory for grassroots organizing, and also, aided by a progressive leader who was willing to take the time to go to a place where there was obviously no political benefit to him back home, but just to go there because people deserved help. Yeah.
And I think that, when there are people who weren't necessarily inspired by Bernie and they don't understand those of us who were so inspired by him, that's why I kind of want to bring to light these stories, that so many of us were inspired for his commitment to do the right thing for the right reasons and not because of political positioning to make himself feel better. And I feel like you really conveyed that in the book, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
So some of the other things I just thought were interesting, and I just wanted to touch on was I didn't realize that at one point Obama had come to stump for Bernie, and you tell kind of a funny story about that and how charming Obama was at that time, which also you had mentioned that a lot of times when people come, they have a lot of demands and they want to control the circumstances, which I'd like to add you didn't. You came into this interview completely blind with no stipulations, and I appreciate that.
No problem. Happy to do it.
So was there anything else that you wanted to kind of add about that experience? It's interesting that Obama came to stump for Bernie, and then a lot of people thought he didn't give him support, during the 2016 election. And was there a disconnect there, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, I don't think so. And I know Bernie was extremely grateful to then Senator Obama, and, he later became president. And it's certainly, from my standpoint, very grateful to him for coming to Vermont. It was a little bit of a surreal event. I was working with Bernie in D.C., and so I had met then Senator Obama on a few occasions. And Obama is, on a human level, just a very warm person. And as you pointed out, we had a lot of people came to Vermont to campaign for Bernie, Democrats and senators and others. And often they do come with a long laundry list of, there was one who, would only go to an event for an hour. All the questions had to be submitted in writing, had to ride in his own car, had very specific, have to eat alone. I need this, that,
wow.
and the thing. Yeah. It's a very long laundry list. And then Senator Obama was completely the opposite. And I remember the scheduling of the event got sort of turned upside down when he arrived, and which for a lot of people would have caused a lot of consternation.
Sure.
And I went up to him and said, "I'm sorry, Senator. It's all up. It's all." And he said, "I'm here for you all. Just tell me where you want me to go." And we proceeded from there. So it's a very fond memory of mine because it's rare in political figures that you find that kind of comfort in one's own self.
Flexibility,
Yeah.
Team player. I like all those things. So then after your book kind of talks about the history of Bernie and your experiences going to Washington with him, what it really breaks down is the presidential campaign per state and what the strategies were and, the challenges that you faced very honestly. And it sounds like one of the largest challenges that you faced was when they shut down access to Vaughn, which is the voter network of information that you get for the voters
Right.
that you had paid for, because there was a slight possible breach that you guys had very acted proactively about to make sure that it wasn't a problem, and that had really crippled the campaign early on in the Iowa caucuses. And then it seems like throughout the journey, for every state, there were more of those kind of hardballs from the Hillary campaign kind of thrown at you. There was the joint fundraising agreement where it seems like they had kind of navigated that agreement to make sure that Hillary Clinton got more of the funds.
Yes, absolutely.
So are there any other instances that you can think of that were highlighted that I didn't touch on throughout the book?
Look, I mean, the general tone and tenor of much of the establishment in 2015 and 2016 was ranged from sort of who are these people to hostility, right? And we had to navigate that throughout the process, both with the national party and in many states. Not in every state, I should tell you. And some states handled it much better than others. Nevada was a particularly rough state. You may remember at the end of the campaign, there were all these allegations of chairs being thrown in a state committee meeting, none of which ever happened. In fact, the NPR ombudsman, wrote a report that their reporting on that had been erroneous, that no chairs had been thrown. But there were these, and the role of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's obviously from Florida, in sort of trying to put her finger on the scale for Secretary Clinton, was a problem throughout the campaign. And, since the campaign, Donna Brazil's book, Donna Brazil revealed for the first time that there was, in fact, an agreement in the summer of 2015 whereby the Clinton campaign gained substantial control over the DNC itself, something even we didn't know at the time, right? And so it was a process that was difficult to navigate. I mean, under the best of circumstances, in an insurgent campaign like Bernie's, where you start at 3% with no money, with no staff, would have been an incredible challenge. But with these kind of impediments being put in our way, it obviously made the job even harder.
So what I feel like is there are so many people who are turned on by Bernie in that campaign and then automatically turned off from politics and specifically the Democratic Party because you hear of that kind of abuse of power. So as a progressive working inside the party, I find it challenging to reach out to these people who are so turned off by hearing those kinds of things and really empower them to believe that they can help change that from the inside. What would be your response to people who, can't seem to let go of the slights that were done throughout that campaign to cripple Bernie and his message?
Yeah, look, I'm fairly blunt about it. I think the Dem exit movement, as it's called by many people, is really just a form of surrender. And I have been at this game for a long time. I started as Bernie's driver in 1986. I've worked with him in campaigns where he got 14% of the vote. I worked with him on a campaign where he almost became the Democratic nominee for president. And if he had, probably would have been the president of the United States. So I've seen real highs and real lows. As I tell people, I lost 33 contests in 2016 in 1 year. That takes its emotional toll on somebody. Right. Tempered somewhat by the 23 wins we had. But look, we are not going to make change in this country unless we keep fighting. And in many places, people are dem-entering, right? Sort of progressives.
I call it dem-occupy.
Dem-occupy, that's another, I haven't heard that term, but that's an interesting term. A little more sort of leaning in. But, I think that's the way we are going to make change in this country. And I got to tell you, I was at the DNC meeting in Chicago this past weekend where the DNC voted up on a 3-1 vote to eliminate superdelegates on the first round of balloting at the convention.
Right.
And a bunch of other reforms. And these were all reforms that we had pushed. And I say we, I mean sort of reform-minded people.
Sure.
The process for this change was negotiated between myself and Robbie Mook, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, before the convention. Tom Perez, the chair, we don't always agree on everything, but I got to say Tom Perez sort of leaned in himself and really staked his chairmanship on passing these reforms. So, and when I was in the room, and I don't want to go on too long on this, but when we went, the first time I went to a DNC meeting was in the summer of 2015 with Bernie in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we walked in. He was invited to speak, as were all the candidates running for the Democratic nomination. And it was like we had just beamed down from Mars, right? People are all like, "Ooh, let's look at these people, but don't get too close," right? And there was like this real sort of apprehension, and they didn't really know what we were about and what we were there. And I got to tell you, so I'm at this meeting, and there's a good 30% of the DNC who are Bernie people who were elected during the course of the 2016 nominating process, and the atmosphere at the DNC is very, very different, because even though the Bernie people, progressives, are still a minority, they are a critical mass that changes the whole conversation. They're no longer like people beaming in from the Starship Enterprise. They are part of the DNC, and you can't ignore 30% of the people in the room, whoever
That's
those
what I
people
say,
are.
30%.
Yeah, and it's getting bigger. And it will get bigger if people come in, and, I'm a big, I don't have a lot of... I don't have a lot of love for couchtivists, what I call couchtivists. You've got to get off the couch,
right?
Put down the mouse. Not that the social media and other things aren't important, but you've got to get off the couch, put down the mouse, stop just talking to your friends and your small networks. You got to go to these Democratic Party meetings. You got to knock on doors for people like Andrew Gilliam in Florida and others. You got to network with people. You got to talk to your friends who are not in your sort of political bubble,
right?
And that's how we make change in America.
So for people who feel like that we need a multi-party system, do you agree with that? Do you think that it's a good strategy to only have two parties in our country? Or what do you feel about eventually reforming it so that we can have other parties that thrive?
Look, I don't have anything sort of I'm not ideologically opposed in any way to having some kind of parliamentary structure that would, promote multiple, more ideologically cohesive parties. I don't a lot of our allies do that. A lot of democratic countries do that. Canadians do it, for instance. Although even they're a little bit closer. They're sort of like a hybrid between us and say Britain. And they have they basically have three parties there. They had four for a while, but they really have three right now. So I don't have any ideological view on that. I mean, the reality is at this particular moment, we have two parties, and the way the structure is set up, it's very difficult to run outside of that process. That's just the reality. Having two parties creates the issue that both parties are necessarily then coalitions, right? And within a coalition, there are going to be people who aren't in your faction. And, what you want is to bring as many of your people in so that your faction is dominant within the coalition.
Right.
That then wins. And that's why the Dem-enter or Dem-occupy, if you're movement is so important. So, but I also want to say this: I do not think that it gives you an excuse to not do anything because you're waiting for us to suddenly have a parliamentary system like Britain or Italy or some other place. That's not happening tomorrow. That's a long-term goal. If people want to work for that, certainly no objection from me. But until we get there, like there are people who have lives and whose lives need improving, and that's what we have to do as progressives.
Yeah, and I think part of what people don't understand who think it's just going to be easy to support a third-party candidate is understand the workings of the party and how they have statutorily set it up to make it very impossible for a third-party candidate to be successful, whether it's statewide or nationally. And I wish more people had an understanding of that so that they could, if they did want to make that change, do it from the inside of one of the parties and start working on that. And that's what a lot of progressives are, which kind of leads me to my next question, is we use this word progressive, especially me working inside the progressive caucus. But now I feel like because progressive politics is becoming more popular, the word is losing its meaning, and people are confused about what it necessarily means. Because there's a spectrum of issues, and people fall in different spots on the issues, and some might be very progressive on one issue, healthcare, if they have someone who's sick in their family. Mm-hmm. So for you, when you talk about the word progressive and you use it, what does it mean? How is it defined, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, and I've started actually, and you're right, this is as progressivism, as our movement has grown, suddenly a lot of other people say, oh, I'm not part of that movement, even if they're clearly not quite sort of lining up on a number of issues, right? But they want to be associated with it because it's popular, obviously, as we're seeing in state after state after state.
Right.
I've started to use the word progressive left often, and that requires a little more from people to, like, if they want to sort of get into that lane. I've used that. It's a problem. We for a long time, people, sort of left of center people, call themselves liberals, right? And that became a sort of tainted word by the Reagan era and what have you. And so it was dropped from the lexicon. But, there has always been a sort of like democratic, small d democratic left, to the left of the liberals. Liberals are people who understand that there are problems in society and who are willing to develop a social safety net to protect people from those excesses, right? But they are not willing to challenge the excesses themselves or the system that produces those excesses. And that's what progressivism is about, that we're looking to make structural changes so that you have, as Bernie says, an economy and a government that works for everybody. Not an economy that works for a few, and then when you realize how bad it is for some people, you put in a social safety net, right? So I support social safety nets, but for liberals, that's the end of the discussion. And I think for progressives, the discussion goes much further. How do we make structural change? More
impactful change as well.
Yeah, more that go to the sort of structure of the economy or structure of society. I mean, if you look at single payer, for instance. Liberal solution has always been, to create a government program that pays for the insurance of people who don't have insurance, right? That's a sort of liberal approach to it. Nothing wrong with that. People get insurance. They're, less susceptible to the vagaries of illness and the financial costs of being ill. So I'm not criticizing that, but that's sort of where the discussion ends, right? But to have a discussion about what is the role of the insurance companies in terms of cherry-picking people, pre-existing conditions. Why do we have insurance companies at all when we could have one big insurance pool that had everybody in it and it would be much more efficient? What is the role of the pharmaceutical companies and sort of, overcharging America and propagating a system that lets people die because they can't afford medicine? Anyway, these are all the sort of that's just one example.
So a holistical approach, because that's generally what I talk about, is how a lot of the issues are holistically related and reflect as our society as a whole. And that when we work on one issue, how we can connect all the other issues.
Oh, absolutely. And, you're recognizing the point you're making, which is entirely valid, the sort of intersection of all of these issues that we face in this country.
So what I have also noticed, and I wanted to get your feedback on, is within the progressive movement, there have become what I would term more obstructionist. People who are so critical, they just want to stop everything. They want to criticize everything. They want to burn it down. They want to almost collapse everything so we can start a whole new system. And I find that to actually be anti-progressive, whereas I think that progressives should be uncompromising in their values. We should be focusing on actually making progress and not just being obstructionist. Do you find that as well in what you see?
Yeah, I do, and I understand what the concern is. The concern is that you will have progressive values and then ultimately retreat to some kind of incrementalism that you see in the sort of the center of the Democratic Party, where you're willing to take a little bit of progress because you can achieve that without it really challenging the status quo, right? And so to me, it is you fight the good fight, you challenge the status quo, you shoot for the end zone, and if you get 20 yards, then you get 20 yards, right? And that 20 yards is valuable and shouldn't be discounted. But you have to understand that you did it in a context where you were shooting for something much more, and that you're going to continue to do that. And that's sort of been the history of progress in this country, is that each generation has built on the progress of the generation that came before it. FDR put in Social Security. It wasn't until Lyndon Baines Johnson that we got Medicare, right? Was that a repudiation of Social Security? Does that mean Social Security was bad? No, but we've been able to go further, and we go further, and we go further, and we go further. And that's how you get power, you institutionalize what change you can, and then you leave it to the next generation to go further.
Right. Well said. So one of the things I wanted to ask about is early in the book, you had mentioned, I think, the word economic populism, or we had kind of talked about populism. And a lot of discussions I get in with people they feel the word populism is a negative connotation. And I really believe we have found that the American people are hungry for some sort of populism, right? And Bernie offered, solutions and talked about the middle class. And then Donald Trump offered a darker populism, and that populism won out. Do you think that populism is necessarily a bad term and something that we should shy away with? And I'm also going to ask you about socialism and these terms in general.
Yeah. So let's talk about labels for a second. Bernie has always characterized himself as a democratic socialist. That is, in American politics, an admittedly confusing term, because there's not a long history of really labor-based politics in the U.S. the way there is in a lot of Western European countries. And so it creates a lot of confusion on people's part, confusing with the Cold War and authoritarian governments in various places, which, of course, couldn't be further from the truth. So I tend not to get sort of tied up into these kind of labels. I think in general, if you talk to people about what's really going on in their life, if you offer solutions to them which seem reasonable and common sense, they're going to be all in. I mean, the polling recently on Medicare for All is 80% of Democrats support it, 52% of Republicans support it. Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
The Republicans, of course, will label that socialism and every other thing. But what's happening is that people are seeing the substance. I have a great faith in people when they are offered real solutions to real problems, and not some piddling around kind of platitudes.
Piddling around.
They actually respond. And that was why Bernie was successful in 2016. He offered big solutions to big problems. People believed that he was authentically a messenger for those solutions. It wasn't something that he poll tested and figured out, because obviously, if it had been sort of driven in that way, he would have had a very different message, right?
Sure.
But he spoke from the heart about what he believed was right, and people responded.
So what I'm hearing, and what we try to focus on, and I could just be trying to reinforce my narrative, is instead of getting caught up on the terms, that we need to constantly stay focused on the issues. And that's one thing that I definitely learned from Bernie, and I try to reinforce, is there's so many things that are thrown out to distract people and to cause drama and take away, that if we stay focused on the issues, we're always going to win. But I think one of the problems with that, or not problems, but I would say challenges, is that the issues in policy on a national or state level are so far disconnected from people's lives and how that actually affects them, that when you start to talk policies with people who aren't really connected to what policy means, they start to glaze over and get disconnected. And I think part of when everyone says, what does progressives need to do to move forward, it's start to figure out, and Bernie was, one of the people who inspired this, but I think we need to dig deeper, is figure out how to translate these complicated policies that happen, in legislation down to how that's going to affect somebody's everyday life, and kind of a shorter explanation.
100%. And, this is sort of communications 101 is, when you look at something for like Medicare for All, for instance, if you had a Medicare for All bill and the accompanying regulations, they would probably fill a bookshelf. Well, you're not going to communicate that bookshelf worth of information to voters. They don't have a tolerance for it. They have other things to do. But when you talk to people about how they and their neighbors have inadequate health care, that they're paying too much on copays and deductibles, they're paying too much for prescription drugs, that the insurance companies are denying people's rightful claims, they're getting ripped off, and if we cut out these middlemen, we can reduce the cost of healthcare for everybody and cover everybody for the same amount of money or less than we're spending now, people go, oh, okay, well, that sounds reasonable, right? And so I've just taken a bookshelf full of rules, regulations, and statutes and turned it into,
how it affects your life.
Right, exactly. And made it relevant. That's the key.
Do you think it'd be some benefit in some of the institutions like our revolution to have talking points on policies and how we can communicate bigger policies or even, more local policies to translate to people's everyday lives? Do you think that would be a benefit?
I do think that would. I do think that would be a benefit. There should be a repository for that kind of communications resources for progressives around the country to talk about issues like Medicare for all and free college and public, free
even
tuition
racial
and public colleges, racial justice, issues of police violence, immigration reform. Obviously, immigration is a very
complex,
is a very complicated issue in terms of the statutes and regulations that apply and how it works and what have you. But, but the messaging, again, there is clear, right? Millions of people living in the shadows here. We need to bring them out of the shadows. We need a path for citizenship. We need to have a rational immigration system, that doesn't treat people like a caged beast. Yeah.
That's a good term for it. So kind of going back a little bit to what I got from the book, one thing that I heard the frustration over and over again, and one of the reasons that I'm starting a podcast is because we have very little control over the media and how that information is disseminated. And it sounded like, a huge frustration was, and what I even noticed was along Bernie's campaign, he didn't get the media attention. It seemed like he got less talking time in the debates. It seems like the stories were sensationalized or slanted. So not to kind of play on to Donald Trump's attack on the media, but how do we also kind of hold the media accountable without sounding like we're demonizing them? Or is it that we have to kind of take back the media? And if so, how do we do that?
Well, this podcast is one of the ways we do that. And, Bernie has been doing something like this on Capitol Hill, holding town meetings with alternative media that that gets millions and millions and millions of viewers. So, but I don't think the comparison between, our media critique and the Trump critique is really the same, because I think people in progressive community acknowledge the role that the media plays in holding elected people honest. We obviously believe in freedom of the press. We want there to be a discussion of ideas. On the other hand, it is not inappropriate to point out that the media is driven by a lot of motives, one of which is the business imperative of running a media company, right? Which requires that you sell advertising. And, this is what drove, not because I don't think that the hosts and producers on CNN are particularly sympathetic to Donald Trump. In fact, if you watch the coverage, you come away thinking that they're not. Same with MSNBC, right? On the other hand, Donald Trump drove ratings like crazy. I quote Les Moonves of CBS in the book, something to the effect of, Donald Trump may be bad for America, but he's great for CBS. And, I remember being at an event where Republicans were yelling at Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, yelling at him about the fact that when Trump had a scheduled event, they would start covering the event even if Trump had not arrived, and the empty podium was there. And until Trump arrived, they just had the screen on an empty podium. And I remember these Republicans yelling at this sort of dinner, at this reception, yelling, "You put up an empty podium." And it's just true. But that was driven by the business imperative of the media. So
is there any way to hold them more accountable for the truth as opposed to just business motivations? Yeah,
I do. And I think it's also important to reward good reporting. I remember many reporters coming to me and bemoaning the fact that when they wrote a negative story about Bernie, felt like they got a lot of social media criticism, let's put it that way. On the other hand, I think that there's less positive reinforcement. There should be more of that, right? When you see good reporting, when you see reporting that reflects the real experience of people in this country, you should, we all have access to email, most of us. Let the reporter know that you thought it was good reporting, that you appreciated that perspective on America or that particular issue was presented.
Okay, so...
Because believe me, reporters read all of that and take it all to heart.
I did not know that. That's good.
Absolutely.
That's the gem of wisdom I was looking for right there.
They're very social media sensitive.
So as I was reading your book, there were so many times that I cried. And one of the times that really touched me when you were talking about, and I might cry just talking about it, when Bernie was able to say Sandra Bland's name on the debate and how important that was to him. And not because he was trying to capitalize off the moment, but because he had a very personal meeting with her mother. And one of the things what was frustrating for me, and I'm sure was for you, was that his message unfortunately wasn't able to reach a lot of community of color in time when, his entire career he's been fighting, and you highlight this in the book, for marginalized communities and empowering people and being the voice of people who are often voiceless. So hearing that touched me, specifically. But what question it brought me to was, as progressives, because unfortunately what I see is the people who are able to have the luxury to really give time to the progressive movement are usually people of privilege, right? We have the time to give, or we have the stability to donate our time and, build a caucus. And a lot of people don't, because they're struggling. So how do you think, or what do you think the progressive movement needs to do to engage communities of color and marginalized communities and empower them and include this in this movement we're building?
Yeah, so that's a really great question and a critically important issue for the success of our movement, because this movement will not succeed unless it is an interracial movement that includes people from every community in this country. And one of the issues, and the issue of race is quite prominent in the book, because it was weaponized by our opponents in a very unfortunate way, which was ultimately divisive. And I just touch on it for a second. It is true that Bernie was not very well known in the African American community, particularly in the South, at the beginning of the campaign, but his support grew exponentially among communities of color, to the point that in the third contest, he won Latino vote in Nevada, the first state with a sizable Latino population. By the time we get to Michigan, which is on March 8th, he is tied with Secretary Clinton with African-American voters under 40. By the time we get to Pennsylvania, which is at the end of the campaign, unfortunately, he's winning African-Americans under 40. The fact that we did not connect with older African-Americans is not unique to the African-American community. We had difficulty reaching older voters of every racial group. Extensive research out of Chicago now shows that Bernie won millennials of all races throughout the race. And so there was a false narrative out there, to the point that, a large group of young people of color who were supporting Bernie felt that they were being whitewashed and erased by the media in a kind of a racist attack that turned them all white. And so they had a hashtag Bernie made me white, which was trended quite a bit on Twitter. It got to the point that the Clinton people talked about Hawaii as a white state when it's the only minority majority state in the country. They talked about Nevada as a white state when they weren't doing as well there, even though that was supposedly part of what they described as their racial firewall. So there was a lot of weaponization of race on the other side. And I thought that was if I have a criticism of the Clinton people, I don't spend my time sort of criticizing the operation of their campaign, because, people can Monday morning quarterback me just as easily, right? Yeah. But, the use of attacks and tactics that are meant to divide up hurting communities from one another, I think, is always destructive to the greater good of bringing people together and changing the country. And so to the extent I have a criticism of them, it would be that.
So how do you think we can engage these communities going forward?
Well, look, I think, in terms of what, Bernie has been doing, if you look at the candidates he's supporting, the new leaders he's supporting, I think it's important for people to see their communities reflected in the leadership of the movement of which they're a part.
Right.
So, if you look at, progressive candidates like Andrew Gilliam, right? If you look at Stacey Abrams, if you look at Ben Jealous, if you look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like on and on, we just just now in Massachusetts. Like, I think, countering this false narrative, more than anything I could have written in this book, the fact that our movement really does not know boundaries in terms of race or gender or any of the other limited geography, any of the other limitations or differences that we have. It really is a sort of intersectional movement that welcomes leaders from all of its constituent parts, right? So there will be white leaders, there will be black leaders, there'll be women leaders, there'll be men leaders, there'll be Latino leaders or Latinx leaders. You know what I mean? So, and that's really the test.
People with disabilities.
People with disabilities who will be in leadership positions. No, people in the transgender community who will be in leadership positions. So the fact that this movement is open to leaders, right? And when people see themselves reflected in the candidates who are running and who are being supported and who are, the standard bearers, I think that will help begin the dialogue, because people have more confidence that they are entering into a dialogue with folks who want to create shared power. Right.
So from what I'm hearing is that we need to support those people in marginalized community and people of color and put them at the forefront to be leaders in the movement and not just engage those communities, but empower them by giving them leadership roles and supporting them in leadership roles, not even giving them, but supporting them.
Yeah, but it's not about giving. Like, there are progressive leaders in communities of color, right? And in many cases, and this happens in poorer white communities as well, or marginalized other communities. Like, people haven't had the same experience with politics. They don't have the same access to resources.
Right.
And so when you see a potential leader in one of these communities, a progressive leader, we want to lift that person up and make sure that person has access to the sort of resources and technical expertise, which, as you know, in politics is very important.
Right.
Politics is very scientific these days, and how you run a campaign, how you run a field program. And so this is the type of help that people get from our Revolution and Progressive Caucuses and other kinds of groups. And the fact that the movement is uplifting people in every community, I think, again, is the way we help build these bridges. Because one thing to say, come into our movement and then support this one or that one.
Yeah.
And people look around and they're like, there's nobody at the top who looks like me.
Right.
Then they begin to be a little bit suspicious. But there has to be room, obviously, for everybody at the bottom, everybody in the middle, and everybody at the top.
So what caught my attention, and we're going to go back to the book and kind of where we get to Florida and the platform hearings and then the actual convention itself, was at some point when you were negotiating how many people you would have, Bernie's team would have at the platform hearing meetings to decide what platform the Democratic Party was going to have going forward and negotiate that. Were you not told by the National Democratic Party, the DNC, that the list that you had given had too many black people on it?
So the ratios on the main platform committee are set by rule, right? There's so many people from each, based on how you did in the state. So there is a pre-platform platform committee, if that makes any sense to people, which basically creates the draft of the platform, which will be the basis for amendments and consideration at the main platform committee. That body is a little more loosely defined in the rules, and it's not really clear. There's one reading that suggests that maybe the chair picks everybody, right? Well, that was not a situation that we were happy with, because Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the chair, and we were not just going to let her pick all her people, because in other contexts she had picked people for different positions, and she almost never picked anybody who was from our point of view, right? And so we finally negotiated a ratio of people on the committee, and we submitted our names, right? So they immediately kicked off some labor leader and the other people,
which surprised me, because you said they had a person, but that it was the exact
had Roseanne
title.
Morrow, the National Nurses, as one of our picks.
Which I love, the nurses union.
Yeah, the nurses union is fantastic. And they said, okay, we're not having labor people. We're like, wait a second, there's a labor person on the Clinton side, which we weren't opposed to. More labor people, the better. And they were like, oh, no, we mean we're not going to have labor national presidents. I was like, oh, okay, now we're starting to split hairs. And then they did kick back our list and say that our list had too many black people on it, that it was, I don't know what to say about that. That is what it is. And we fought over it because we wanted the people, this is just like when the DNC kept, their Clinton campaign kept Nina Turner from speaking at the convention, something which I, behind the scenes, fought with them quite hard about, to the point that we pulled all of our whips off the floor of the convention and said, you want to control the convention? You control it.
Right.
We're not going to help you. But they were adamant about it. I don't know what to tell you.
And I think that's something that when we're recruiting people to work inside the party, and, because it's not sexy working inside the party. That's not the fun part. From somebody who's been an activist for more of my 20s and now I'm working in the party, it's way more exciting to be, protesting with people of like mind, to be, fighting people within the party is not the fun part. But that's the mentality that we need to maintain the majority, or at least some, and be able to fight back against. And I think people need to understand what we're up against.
Right.
So there was the platform hearing that happened here. I had a lot of friends that went and fought for that. And one of the things that I feel was unfortunate that didn't get enough media coverage, which would have helped going forward after the convention, was what a progressive platform, because of the dedication of Bernie, that he didn't just quit at that point and take his ball and support Hillary Clinton, that he inspired so much of that platform to really be progressive. And after the convention, and I went home and I licked my wounds and I started trying to move forward, I tried to really explain to people how important that was and that we needed to fight for that going forward. And I feel like that was kind of lost, amongst all the noise and drama, amongst the fallout. And I feel like that was a real disappointment because people don't understand how hard we worked to make that platform and what a win that was.
Sure, absolutely.
And so speaking of the convention, I was a Bernie delegate. I had no idea what I was getting into.
Neither did I. Go ahead.
I thought I was going to, go and support Bernie, and I would come in contact with other Democrats, and we would discuss issues that set us apart, and we would talk about the issues that we were hoping Hillary Clinton would support, and they would agree, and we would find some ground to move forward. And I didn't understand that we were going to be attacked and belittled and discredited, and how they were going to try to silence what was going on and the division that I was going to walk into. That was a real game changer for me. And it's one of the things that inspired me to come back and get involved in the party, as I saw from the inside how frustrating that was. But so for those of us who saw like how much manipulation there was going on from the floor, on the back end, when you were seeing that, when you were seeing that they turned the lights out on the California delegation,
right,
or when in the Florida delegation we started chanting "No war," they held a flag up over us to hide us, and you saw kind of these attempts to minimalize the frustrations that we had. What was going on in the top end of that at the Bernie campaign?
Yeah, so we had a very different view of what should go on in the convention, I think, than the Clinton people did. Although on some points we were united. We obviously wanted to have a convention that was robust but not unnecessarily contentious, right? Which the media would then spin out into this narrative which would have benefited Trump. So we were very opposed to that. I know there was at one point a number of people wanted to hold anti-TPP signs at the convention, and they wanted our help in stopping people from doing that. And we were like, I don't really think we're going to do that because Bernie was against the TPP.
Right.
Ostensibly, Hillary was against the TPP. And we just didn't think that was an appropriate sort of, reason to censor people's views on something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where the vast majority of Democrats were all in the same position, including Bernie and Hillary. So what's the problem? There were other efforts when, we tried to be helpful in terms of, stopping disruptions that were, like I said, would have been manipulated by the media, were manipulated by the media to emphasize divisions in the party. There's clearly a discussion going on in the party right now. There's clearly, two wings, maybe there's more than two wings, I don't know, two wings, certainly the progressive wing, which is now becoming the whole bird, as I like to say. But, there's going to be antagonism, but it was much less, frankly, than we have seen at other points in the Democratic Party's history.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah. Because especially someone in Florida, like I heard you talk about how when the Florida delegation protested Debbie Wasserman Schultz, that was a turning point.
It was. Yes.
And then you also talked about how, you were not focused on Florida because we're just kind of a state full of older voters who have closed primaries.
I don't think that's quite. I think it's a little more nuanced than that. Look, the problem we had throughout the campaign was even when you raise $230 million,
sure, you have to figure out how to spend your resources.
You have to spend your money. And
Absolutely.
Florida was on the same day as Ohio, Illinois, North Carolina, and Missouri, and choices had to be made, very difficult choices that I didn't want to make. And, you have to look at polling numbers, you have to look at the likelihood of the return on investment of money. And that's an unfortunate part of politics, but something that
and I don't think that's a reflection in anything negative on your end. I think it's a reflection in Florida of how what we're up against as progressives. And, you had mentioned closed primaries as one of the reasons that it's a hard state to win in Florida. We have older voters. We have closed primaries. And we are advocating for open primaries, or at least semi-open primaries in our state.
Right.
And it's something we're pushing for. Yes,
vote.
Participate.
Yes.
Can you give me some feedback on that? Because we get a lot of pushback, and that's one of the hardest things that we have to, one of the most challenging things we're up against, and I think that would be a benefit to us. What do you think about our closed primary state and how that might hurt our party?
Yeah, well, there's the states who have closed primaries is a small minority of states. Most states do not have closed primaries. You should know. So there's Florida and Oregon, and then other than that, it's only found in machine politics states in the Northeast: Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. And closed primaries are used by party machines in states where you have essentially one-party rule to control the nominating process, right? Well, you may have had one party rule in Florida at one point, but you don't have it anymore. And to the extent you do, it's the wrong party. So, the problem with closed primaries, there are many of them, but one of the things it does is it locks out young people who when they register to vote, over 50% of them are registering as MPAs. And so you were telling those people, come out and work for our candidate. Give us a donation. Talk to your friends. But we don't want you to vote unless you have the little donkey emblazoned card in your wallet. And that's not the case in a place like Virginia or Vermont or, almost any other state in the country. It disproportionately impacts young people of color, frankly, who are also registering in exceedingly high numbers as independents, but are almost exclusively democratically aligned independents, and so they would be voting in the primaries. It is a way to make the party older, whiter, and less relevant.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to move on quickly to some listener questions, and then I just want to close with kind of talking about what's going on as far as Mayor Gilliam and his winning the nomination.
Very exciting.
Along with kind of our voter restoration that we're going to have the Amendment 4 on the ballot. Yes. But some of the feedback that I've gotten is trying to prioritize how important fundraising is in an election, specifically to utilizing tools which we find are important now. You said they've become very complicated strategies with social media and algorithms and paying for the technology to figure out voters' patterns. And in this day, we're seeing a lot of candidates who aren't fundraising the most amount of money becoming successful. So where do you see the place of fundraising in the viability of a candidate's success?
Yeah, this is the issue. So money is not the only measure. Money is like in politics, like everything else. It gives you access to tools and technology and paid people and what have you. So money is always an advantage. But you don't need to have the most money to win. But you do have to have in general, and there are exceptions, but
sure.
You do have to have a threshold amount of money to win. And the problem is, as I point out in the book, it's not always clear what that threshold is in the midst of a campaign. We have seen this with progressive candidates across the country. You have a centrist versus a progressive. The progressive loses. And they're like, oh, the progressive message isn't resonating with voters. And you're like, really? The person just got outspent 30-1. Right. My good friend Pete D'Alessandro running in a Democratic primary in Iowa. He was one of our top Iowa people running in a Democratic primary for Congress. Between his two opponents was outspent 10-1 on television. He didn't win. Shocker. Not a surprise to me. So, you do need money to win, to run. You don't need the most money, but you need a requisite threshold. Like I said, what that is varies from race to race. So it's hard to put a certain relationship between your money and the other person's money into a formula. But if you don't have any money or almost no money, it is very difficult to win a race other than a very, very local race.
So what I feel like, and I could be wrong, you have way more experience than I do, is that it's also how you use the money, right? Because I see so many candidates who rely on mailers that aren't necessarily human contact, or waste the money on things where consulting companies tell them to waste the money. So I think it's making sure that you utilize that money for the most effective voter contact and to get your message out should be part of this progressive strategy. It's not just fundraising, but making sure that you use it in a way that's going to reach your voters and get your message out.
No, that's right. And different voters are reached with different mediums, right? So if you want to reach older voters who, as you know, are more likely to vote, although less likely to vote for progressives in some cases, not all cases,
right?
Then television is by far the most efficient way.
Right.
I can show you polls in state after state in the 2016 primary cycle of our polling before television went up and after it went up. And polls move in a short period of time, move 15 or 20 points in your direction. There's no other medium or investment that creates that kind of return.
Interesting.
On your poll position. Now, if you're looking at exclusively reaching younger voters, obviously, there's various digital strategies for doing that. Door-to-door is very effective. Also, the most effective thing is to have somebody talk to somebody else they know. Mail has its place in this, although I don't ever believe it should be the dominant form of communication. Although I will tell you, in Iowa, we had a very innovative strategy for reaching out to 17-year-olds because in Iowa, they could vote in the primary if they were going to be 18 by the general election. And we actually did mail to them, even though the conventional wisdom is young people don't open their mail. Or don't pay attention to mail because they were living at home with their parents. And we actually believe that in that circumstance, the receipt of mail would be almost like an event at the house.
Right,
like,
sure.
Oh, look who got mail, right? And it actually paid off.
All right. So one of a lot of the questions that I get have a similar nature, and they're essentially like, how do we keep momentum going forward? How do we bridge the divide that's happening within our party? What should progressives be focused on? I think everybody's looking for inspiration to find a strategy or something to motivate us going forward, because it all feels very chaotic right now. What's kind of your messaging in general to progressives on the strategy going forward, bridging the party, working alongside the party divide, kind of the chaos of politics right now? What would be your general message to progressives?
Yeah, well, look, my first message is this. We are winning. We are winning. All over the country, we are winning. We are accomplishing things that 2 or 3 years ago, nobody would have thought is possible. So that's the first message. So don't be disheartened. I know it's easy to get disheartened. It's easy to feel isolated sometimes, but don't. We need to keep doing what we are doing, which is helping to elect progressive candidates, mobilizing around progressive issues when there's not an election taking place, and working to transform the Democratic Party so that it can be a real vehicle for change in this country. That's what we have to do. People are doing it, and they are doing it to great success. So I encourage you to double down on what's going on now.
And where do you feel like is the place for moderates in this movement? So if the Republican Party has become so far to the right, and if we succeed in pushing the Democratic Party more to the left, if there's only two party, where do you see the place for people who don't necessarily identify and really just do, on the spectrum of things, fall in a more moderate place? Where do you find the place for them in this movement?
Yeah, well, look, there's certainly a place, I don't know about the progressive movement. I mean, to the extent they become progressive, will be part of it. But, you know, there is a place for them in the party. They just won't be the dominant wing of the party as they have been for the last, few decades when we have had a number of failures. The more progressive wing of the party has been dominant, after the New Deal era, and we had Democratic dominance in national politics for decades and decades and accomplished great things. There's still, again, as I said earlier, there's still a lot more to go. We got to build on the past successes. We got to protect the gains we made and move forward. So they will be part of our coalition in the Democratic Party, but they will not be the dominant coalition. They will not be directing things the way they have, before, with no input from progressives, no compromise, no nothing. And the effect of them having been in charge the last couple of decades is that we've lost over 1,000 legislative seats around the country. Hopefully, we'll gain some back, including here in Florida. But we're doing that with much more progressive messaging that excites working class people and people in marginalized communities. Those people are now coming out. These people came out for Andrew Gilliam. This statistic about the huge number of people who voted for Andrew Gilliam who had not voted in the past 3 primary elections in Florida, I think is telling in terms of who we need to be reaching out to. And so there's an old notion of politics of Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right, moderates in the middle. But that's just not an accurate model of how of the American sort of political spectrum. In truth, there are a huge number of independents who are, in fact, to the left of the Democratic Party. And when the Democratic Party moves to the right, those people don't follow along. They fall off.
Right.
And they don't vote, and they check out.
Exactly.
And we have got to excite them with a bold progressive message, and that's how we're going to win. That's how Andrew Gilliam's winning. That's how Vangelis is winning. That's how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is winning. That's how people are winning all over this country. So
speaking of Andrew Gilliam, today he announced his VP selection. What did you think about that?
Well, look, I thought it was, he is a true progressive. He's not an opportunistic progressive. And, he picked another progressive to be his running mate. And I think that was a clear sign that he was not going to be the type of candidate who runs a progressive primary and then is kind of, half-hearted fainting to the middle in order to, appease some kind of supposed moderate group of voters out there who are just waiting in the wings. So I think what he signaled to everybody in Florida is that he's a person of principle, that he ran on those principles and won on those principles, and that he's going to run and win on those principles in the general election. So I want to applaud him and his campaign for a really bold move.
I agree. But then there are some critics that say it would have been a bolder move to, as we've talked about, empowering communities of color, possibly since there are so many good options, choose maybe a woman of color or, someone from a more marginalized community to put at the forefront and partner with. Do you think that would have been more of a progressive choice?
Look, I'm not in the Andrew Gilliam campaign. And,
You're not?
I am not. I am a supporter of Andrew Gilliam, but I'm not writing his speeches and whispering in his ear. He, being a person of color himself, I think we have to trust his judgment on this, that he picked who in his mind would be the best running mate, who would be the best person to assist him as governor of Florida. I'm confident that if he is elected, he will have many, 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 many appointments to make,
right,
and that he will have a very diverse and representative administration with people from many, many communities who make up the sort of progressive coalition.
I love that answer. What do you feel about now so many of, and for lack of the better terms, we hate to use labels, but moderates who are so frustrated that he didn't choose a more moderate candidate such as Gwen Graham or go in that direction? Do you feel like there's a little bit of hypocrisy from what you've seen when maybe more moderate candidates
have... When Hillary didn't pick Bernie, you mean?
Exactly.
Is that where you're going?
Something similar to that, possibly.
Look, when you win the nomination, look, I did not have any bitterness or hard feelings that Hillary Clinton didn't pick Bernie Sanders to be her running mate.
Right.
She probably would have won if she had, but
right.
For the record. But in fact, one of her top staffers, this Harvard event I referenced earlier, said as much. But not said as much. It said exactly that. But when you win, you're going to run a campaign. You need to pick a person who is going to be able, that you believe is going to make your success more likely in the general election, who's going to be able to assist you when you are elected.
Right.
And so I don't really begrudge candidates who have to make, running mate selections. Like they make the choice they make. Should Barack Obama have picked Hillary Clinton in 2008? I don't know. A lot of people said yes, right?
Right.
So he picked Joe Biden like that. I don't get too exercised about it.
I wish they would connect their feelings that they have right now to maybe some feelings that progressives had at other times, but that's a whole other conversation.
So I didn't go down that road, but I hear you.
So we're going to start to wrap up. I will have one kind of question at the very end, but is there anything and again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this and joining us. Is there anything that you want to close with or anything that you want to talk about?
No, I do want to reiterate the success that we are having in across the country, and it's not just in Florida. It is in places likely and unlikely, and that's what's amazing about the progressive movement is that the power of the message that we are bringing to the American people is the message that can be successful everywhere. Right? This was the problem. I mean, beyond the substance of the problem that sort of neoliberals or moderates had, is that their message falls flat in many, many, many places, and so it required the Democratic Party to concede running viable campaigns in a lot of places. So our movement knows no boundaries, and we are showing here in Florida and a lot of other places that this is the path for the Democratic Party to success. And the more we demonstrate that with the election, for instance, of Andrew Gilliam to be governor of Florida, I think there'll be more and more people within the party who will say, you know what, they're right, that is the way to win, and they'll move in our direction. And there'll be more and more people who have left the party who say, you know what, look at this, it actually can happen, and they'll come back in as well.
Yeah, and I do want to say I think that it's really important that we do focus on the Voter Rights Amendment for restoration rights to make sure that everyone has a voice. I know I want to double back to that.
Yeah, no, I want. There's actually a section in my book about the disenfranchisement of people, and there's a lot of statistics in there, including statistics about Florida, which I'm sure are now familiar to people because of.
I think we were fifth on your list. You were talking about the other states
because of Amendment 4. So. This is a problem in Florida. It's a problem in a lot of other places. I'm somewhat proud to tell you that I grew up in Vermont where you can vote from prison.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to save this question for the end, but I just want to say thank you so much for writing this book. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, How Bernie Won, I think should almost be required reading for anybody in the movement, whether it's just campaign advice on how to run a real grassroots campaign to get inspiration, whether it's talking about Bernie's past. It was a pleasure to experience it. Thank you so much for writing it.
That's very kind.
And doing this tour, which allowed me to speak to you. And I guess my last question is, what's your favorite comic book?
Oh, look at this. They all come back to the comic book question. So I'm older than many people who may be listening to this podcast. And so I like a lot of the older comic books. I guess in many ways the Batman is probably the character that stands up the test of time the best.
And did you run?
Bernie, by the way, is Superman. Bernie was asked
And I
Batman
think
versus
there's
Superman.
shirts of him like that, right?
Right. But that's that's a generational thing.
And we're asking because you owned a comic book store for a little while. You
I
do.
still do.
You still do.
Absolutely. Victory Comics in Falls Church, Virginia.
All right. Well, thank you again so much. I appreciate it. You've been listening to Reclaiming My Mind. If you ever have any feedback or questions, don't hesitate to email me at jvaughn, VAUGHN 30 @gmail.com. And thank you so much for listening.